What happened? She offered her virginity for food, but the rancher said, "We don't need gold. We need you." Witness this unbelievable, true, inspired story right here on Whisper of the Past. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share where you're watching from. Let's get started! The year was 1933, and America was in the grip of the Great Depression. Cities were filled with men standing in long bread lines. Factories had gone silent, and farms were failing across the nation. Families that had once known comfort and modest stability were reduced to scraping for scraps, and many mothers wept as their children went to bed hungry. Texas, a land of both harsh sun and resilient souls, was no exception. Dust storms swept across plains, jobs disappeared, and people who had once dreamed of prosperity now counted every crumb of bread as if it were gold. Evelyn Carter was just 19. But the weight of the world already bent her shoulders. She had grown up in Amarillo, in a modest wooden house that once rang with laughter. Her father had been a mechanic, working long days repairing engines and trucks until pneumonia took him swiftly, leaving the family without its strongest pillar. Her mother, weakened by grief and illness, had taken to bed most days, unable to keep up with household tasks. Evelyn's two younger brothers, James and Robert, barely 12 and 8, were too young to shoulder such a heavy burden, though they tried with small acts of bravery, fetching water, gathering firewood, or skipping meals so Evelyn could eat instead. But hunger was a cruel beast, and it gnawed at them relentlessly. For weeks, Evelyn searched for work. She went from shop to shop, offering to clean floors or wash clothes, but doors closed in her face. "We can't afford to hire," they told her, their own eyes hollow with need. Each rejection deepened her desperation. She walked the dusty streets with her shawl wrapped tight, clutching at hope as it slipped further from her grasp. One evening, she returned home to find her brothers curled up on the wooden floor, stomachs groaning in pain. There was no bread left, no flour, no beans, only a jug of water and the sound of her mother's quiet cough. Evelyn knelt beside them, stroking their hair, whispering promises she wasn't sure she could keep. She felt useless, like a fragile twig trying to hold up a crumbling house. That night, as the wind howled outside, Evelyn made a decision she prayed she would never have to make. The next morning, under a blazing Texas sun, she set out toward the Miller Ranch, a place whispered about in town. Jacob Miller, its owner, was a rugged rancher in his early 40s. People said he was stern but fair, a man who worked from dawn to dusk and never bent to the storms of misfortune. Unlike others, his ranch seemed to endure. Cattle still grazed his fields, horses still roamed, and somehow food was still plentiful behind those wooden fences. For Evelyn, it felt like her last chance. Her shoes were worn thin as she walked the miles to the ranch. Dust clung to her dress, sweat streaked her face, but she pressed forward with trembling resolve. Her heart pounded as the ranch house came into view, a large, weather-beaten structure that seemed almost intimidating against the empty horizon. She saw ranch hands moving in the distance, tending to cattle, while Jacob himself stood near the barn, inspecting a wagon wheel. When Evelyn reached him, she hesitated, her courage faltering. Up close, Jacob looked even more imposing. His broad shoulders bore the strength of decades of labor. His face was lined by sun and hardship, and his eyes carried both sharpness and depth. He looked at her with curiosity, then recognition. He had seen her in town before, a girl with tired eyes and two little brothers trailing behind her. "What brings you here, miss?" he asked, his voice steady and low. Evelyn swallowed hard, her throat dry. She had rehearsed the words in her mind 100 times, yet now they felt like shards of glass cutting her tongue. Finally, with tears burning her eyes, she whispered, "My family is starving. I have nothing left to trade for food, nothing except myself. If you'll give us bread, if you'll give us something to live on, I will give you me, my virginity." The words hung heavy in the air, more painful than any silence. Jacob's expression hardened, though not with the cruelty she expected. For a moment his jaw tightened, and his hand gripped the wooden rail beside him. Evelyn braced herself for laughter, or anger, or perhaps a cold acceptance. Men in town had taken advantage of desperate women before. She had heard the stories whispered in shame. She had prepared herself for humiliation, for sacrifice, for anything that might bring food to her family. But Jacob surprised her. He stepped closer, lowering his voice, his tone firm but laced with something she could not name. "Gold isn't what we need, Evelyn," he said, "and I don't need that from you either. What we need is you." Evelyn stared at him, unable to understand. Her lips parted, trembling as she stammered, "Me? But I'm worth nothing. I can't offer anything except—" "Don't ever say that again," Jacob cut in sharply, though not unkindly. "You have two strong hands. You know how to cook, how to clean, how to care for others. You've carried more weight on your shoulders than most grown men I know. That's worth more than you realize. Stay here, work with us. Help in the kitchen, tend the animals, and earn your place. I'll see to it your family doesn't go hungry." The dam inside Evelyn broke. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she covered her face with her hands, not out of shame, but from the overwhelming relief that someone had seen her humanity rather than her desperation. For months she had felt invisible, reduced to nothing but hunger and weakness. And here was a man telling her she was more than enough, not for what she could give away, but for who she was and what she could do. Jacob reached into the barn and brought out a small sack of flour, a jar of beans, and some dried meat. "Take this home to your family," he said gently. "Come back tomorrow at sunrise. There's work here if you're willing. And if you are, your brothers and mother will never sleep hungry again." Evelyn clutched the food to her chest as though it were treasure. Her legs trembled, but her heart felt stronger than it had in months. She whispered "thank you" over and over, her voice breaking, before turning back down the long road toward home. That night, when she returned, her brothers' faces lit up with joy at the sight of real food. Her mother wept quietly, holding Evelyn's hand as they shared a meal for the first time in days. Lying awake on the wooden floor, Evelyn thought about Jacob's words. "What we need is you." For the first time, she believed that maybe she was more than the sum of her desperation. Maybe she had strength she had yet to discover. Tomorrow would bring work, sweat, and labor, but it would also bring dignity, and dignity was worth more than gold. The first light of dawn spread across the Texas plains as Evelyn rose from her straw mattress. The air was still cool, carrying the faint scent of dust and mesquite. She dressed in her worn dress, tied her hair back with a faded ribbon, and kissed her mother softly on the forehead before stepping outside. Her brothers were still asleep, curled together for warmth, their bellies for once not aching with hunger. She carried Jacob's words in her chest like a spark. "What we need is you." The walk to the Miller Ranch felt different this time. Yesterday, she had dragged her feet with desperation, but today there was purpose in her stride. Her hunger had not vanished, nor had her worries, but hope was a weight she was willing to carry. The rising sun painted the fields gold as she approached the wooden fences, where cattle grazed lazily, tails swatting at flies. Jacob was already awake, of course. Ranchers rose before the sun, and he stood by the corral, tightening the straps on a restless horse. When his eyes met Evelyn's, he gave a short nod. "You came?" "Yes, sir," she said, a little breathless. "No need for sir," he replied, handing her a pair of worn gloves. "If you're going to work here, you're part of the crew. First lesson, you call me Jacob." Evelyn hesitated, then tried his name aloud. It felt strange on her lips, but strangely grounding. Jacob. A man she had once feared now stood before her, not as a stranger of power, but as someone willing to give her a place. Her first tasks were simple, but grueling. She hauled buckets of water to the troughs, swept the barn, and fed the chickens. The ranch hands watched her with curiosity at first, some amused at the sight of a frail town girl trying to carry heavy pails. But Evelyn did not stop. Sweat rolled down her temples. Her hands blistered inside the rough gloves, and her dress clung to her skin with dust and grime. Still she pushed on. Each motion was a silent promise. She would not waste this chance. Jacob kept an eye on her, correcting her grip on a shovel, showing her how to scatter feed without frightening the hens. and teaching her the rhythm of the ranch. When she faltered, he did not scold but encouraged. "You're stronger than you think," he said when she nearly dropped a sack of grain. "Strength isn't in the arms, it's in the will." By midday, she sat with the ranch hands for a meal of beans, bread, and coffee. They teased her gently, as men often did, but it was not cruel. One of them, a lanky cowboy named Tom, tipped his hat and said, "Didn't think you'd last past morning, miss." "Guess we were wrong." Evelyn smiled shyly, grateful for the warmth of acceptance, even if it was rough around the edges. As days turned into weeks, Evelyn found herself transforming. Her hands grew calloused, her arms stronger, and her back straighter. She learned how to milk cows, mend fences, and even ride a horse with surprising ease. At night, exhausted but proud, she walked home with a small portion of food Jacob set aside for her family. Each evening, her brothers ran to greet her, their faces bright with joy, and her mother's weary eyes softened with gratitude. The home that once felt like a place of despair now flickered with life again. But more than food, Evelyn brought back something else: hope. She told her brothers stories of the ranch, of stubborn horses and playful calves, of the wide-open sky that stretched forever. She described the feeling of working until her body ached, then sitting down with bread and beans that tasted like triumph. Slowly, they began to believe that better days might truly come. Jacob remained a steady presence in her new world. He was not a man of many words, but when he spoke, his voice carried weight. One evening, as they repaired a broken fence together, he said quietly, "You remind me of this land. It takes a beating, storms, drought, wind, but it never gives up." "You've got that same spirit." Evelyn flushed at the words, unsure how to respond. She wasn't used to being compared to something strong. The bond between them deepened in subtle ways. When she stumbled, Jacob's hand was there to steady her. When her brothers came to the ranch on rare occasions, he welcomed them warmly, giving them small chores and teaching them how to handle tools. He never once reminded her of the desperate offer she had made that first day. Instead, he gave her dignity, treating her not as a beggar, but as someone of worth. Yet life was not suddenly easy. The depression's grip was strong, and dust storms sometimes swept across the plains with choking force. One afternoon, a storm rolled in with such fury that the sky turned black and the wind howled like a beast. Evelyn and Jacob scrambled to herd the cattle into shelter, their clothes whipped by sand, their lungs burning with dust. She stumbled, coughing, nearly blinded, but Jacob's strong hand pulled her through. When they finally secured the last of the herd, both of them collapsed against the barn wall, faces streaked with dirt. Evelyn laughed breathlessly through her coughs, and Jacob, to her surprise, let out a deep chuckle. In that dark, stormy moment, they shared a spark of joy, two survivors bound by grit. Nights on the ranch also taught Evelyn quiet lessons. She learned to listen to the coyotes calling in the distance, to watch the stars that blanketed the sky with shimmering beauty. Jacob sometimes joined her on the porch, sitting in silence. He didn't fill the air with needless talk, but his presence was steady, like the land itself. Slowly, Evelyn realized that strength wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was the silence of a man who stood unshaken, offering his steadiness to others. Her brothers admired Jacob deeply. James once whispered to Evelyn, "He's like the father we lost." The words pierced her heart, but in a tender way. She knew they were right. Jacob had become more than a rancher. He was a guide, a shield, a man who gave without asking for anything in return. As months passed, Evelyn grew into her role. The girl who once thought herself worthless had become a young woman with pride in her work. The ranch was no longer just Jacob's. In many ways, it became her sanctuary too. The cattle knew her touch, the horses responded to her calm, and the kitchen smelled of meals she had learned to cook with skill. Jacob began entrusting her with more responsibilities, letting her oversee chores, manage supplies, and teach younger helpers. She was no longer a desperate girl begging for food. She was a pillar of the ranch's survival. One evening, after a long day, Jacob stood with her by the corral. The sunset painted the sky in streaks of crimson and gold. Evelyn leaned on the wooden rail, breathing in the cool air. Jacob glanced at her, his expression softer than usual. "You know," he said quietly, "the day you came here I thought you'd last a week at most. But you've proven me wrong. You're stronger than most folks I know." Evelyn met his gaze, her voice trembling but steady. "I thought I had nothing to give. I was ready to throw away the only thing I thought had value. But you showed me I had more. You saved me, Jacob." He shook his head slowly. "No, Evelyn, you saved yourself. All I did was give you the chance." Her heart swelled at his words, tears blurring her vision. For the first time in her life, she truly believed she was not a burden, not a beggar, not a girl defined by desperation. She was a woman of worth, with hands that could work, a spirit that could endure, and a heart that still beat with hope. That night, when she returned home, her mother clasped her hand and whispered, "Your father would be proud." Evelyn carried those words with her, alongside Jacob's steady voice, as proof that her life had turned from despair to purpose. And so, in the hardest years America had known, on a ranch in the heart of Texas, a starving girl discovered that her true value was never her body, but her courage, her will, and her unwavering fight for the people she loved.